Everyone, and welcome to the John DeVito Show. Today, it is Wednesday, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm taking a little break from work. I've been working like crazy all day today. And I'm going to take a break from politics and news and all the negative things that are going on in the world. As many of you know, one of my favorite things in the entire world is baseball. I'm a huge baseball fan. You know, my father played. He was a very good baseball player, had some interest from major league teams. I was a baseball player as well. I played throughout my life, including as a semi-professional baseball player after my college football career was over. My sons, my two youngest sons, both played baseball competitively. My youngest made the middle school team this year and plays AAU. And my third, Ethan, made JV1 at Wachusett High School this year and also plays AAU baseball. So in our house, baseball is a big thing. I probably go to over 100 games a year, and those are my son's games. Those are, AAU games, and then I do go to the occasional Boston Red Sox game, as well as going to the AAA affiliate, the Worcester Red Sox, which is located near where I live. So in my family, baseball is a big thing. Even my daughter Caitlin played softball for many years, and I always enjoyed going to her games as well. So from my perspective, there are a lot of great sports in the world. We have football, we have basketball, we have hockey, tennis, golf. There's so many sports out there you can choose from. Today, lacrosse, soccer. I mean, there are so many different sports, and I think all of them are amazing in their own way. But to me, nothing compares to baseball. Baseball, to me, it symbolizes the birth of spring. You enjoy the season throughout the course of the summer. It goes into the fall, and as the season starts to get old, you start to see the leaves changing colors and the leaves falling off trees, and you're going into winter. So baseball almost symbolizes the rebirth of a new year every year in the spring. And that's one of the things I love about it. I mean, there are a lot of complaints about the game of baseball. People say that it's too slow. People say that the games go on for too long. But see, those are the things that I like about baseball. I enjoy the fact that the games are long. I enjoy the fact that the games are slow. What better time in the world is there to unplug from your television, unplug from your phone, unplug for social media, unplug for all the problems we have in the world, and sit out on a nice sunny day? You know, if you're in a major league park, you're sitting in the stands, the weather's beautiful, you're enjoying time with your family, with your friends, whatever it may be. When I'm out watching my children play, I'm sitting in a camping chair, sitting next to friends that we've gotten to know over the last decade because we've watched our kids grow up together. And we sit and we chat, and I talk to my wife and I talk to my children. And to me, baseball is one of those sports where it is one of the oldest pastimes in America. And even though the games are long, and even though they can, be slow, it's about enjoying time with your family, enjoying time with your loved ones, and getting out and enjoying just an amazing game that's like a game of chess. If you don't know a lot about baseball, you don't know how many little things go into the game of baseball. There's so much to it, about the pitcher choosing his pitchers, working with the catcher, playing in the right position depending on the hitter. There are so many little changes and so many little variations of the game that you just don't understand unless you really pay attention. So to me, I know that some people will disagree with me. There is nothing in the world I love more than baseball. I think it's an amazing sport. I love every minute of it, and I am a huge baseball fan. So I figured today I would do a show getting away from the usual shows that I have about news and politics and current events, because sometimes we just need a break. And for me, there's no greater break than baseball. So now, keep in mind, I did not create this list. I located a list online from Bleacher Report, and I'm going to break down this list, and I'm going to talk about some of the players on the list. Some of these players you may not know. Some of the players go way back in history in baseball. And that's another one of the nice things about baseball. Baseball is such a historic sport. It's a sport that's based on statistics. And I'm a person that really enjoys statistics. And, when I keep a scorebook for one of my kids' teams or something to that effect, I'm actually kind of a stat nerd where I actually keep stats. I have a spreadsheet, and I actually give that to the head coach and give him, information that helps him make the choices based on who should be on the field and who's hitting well and all those type of things. So baseball is a game. It's a national pastime. It's a game based on strategy. It's a game based on statistics. And it's one of those games where when you're hitting well, the baseball coming in from the pitcher, it looks like a beach ball. You feel like, you could hit anything, but when you're struggling and you're in a slump, it doesn't matter who's on the mound. It doesn't matter how well you hit the ball. It seems like the ball doesn't drop in, and a baseball slump could be one of the worst things, you could possibly deal with. So I've got this list again from Bleacher Report. And before they even got into the top 25 Major League Baseball players of all time, they came up with a list of honorable mentions. And I started to think about how difficult it would be to make an actual list of the top 25 Major League Baseballs in the history of the game, because there are so many great players from so many different eras to compare. And it's difficult when you look at someone like a Babe Ruth. How do you compare him to a Mark McGwire? Babe Ruth played in the early 1900s. He was a big man. Baseball was a different game back then. There weren't as many home runs. And if you look at someone like Mark McGwire, he played in the steroid era. He was 6'5", 280 pounds, a big mountain of a man who was using performance-enhancing drugs. So it's kind of hard to make comparisons between generations. But it looks like they've done it here. And as far as I could tell, they did a decent job. I'm sure I'm going to agree with some of the names on this list, and I'll probably disagree with some others. So let's get into this list. Now, this is the list of honorable mentions that the Bleacher Report came up with, and it's a pretty good list of players that are very difficult to even imagine these players not being in that top 25 list. So let me get on this list, and let me kind of talk about a few of these names on this list. I'm not going to go into great detail about all of them, but in my mind, really any of these players could have made that top 25 list. So the first name I see on the list is a player that I saw play when I was a kid and was definitely one of the best catchers in that era in the 1970s, Johnny Bench, who played for the Cincinnati Reds. I mean, Johnny Bench was a phenomenal catcher. He was a good defensive catcher. He had a strong arm. He had a good bat. And he played for the Cincinnati Reds, who at the time were known as, I think it was the Big Red Machine. I mean, they beat the Red Sox in the 1975 World Series when I was 7 years old. And Johnny Bench was just an iconic name. And he's one of the honorable mentions that did not make the top 25 greatest baseball players of all time. And there are many names on this list that I'm sure were very difficult for them not to include. But I could see Johnny Bench being obviously one of the great players, but also being one of those players that was probably very difficult to squeeze into that top 25. If you were looking at a top 50, maybe his name would have been on that list. So the next one on the list, again, another iconic baseball player. His career was cut short, unfortunately, but Roberto Clemente. Now, I never got to see Roberto Clemente play, but he was, from what I heard, he was like a five-tool player back in the day. He could hit, he could run, he could play defense. I mean, he had the complete package. And unfortunately, his career was cut short. But Roberto Clemente, another name that was on the honorable mention list, but did not make the top 25. Now, this one I have kind of a hard time with. One of the most dominating pitchers in the history of the game, Bob Gibson, was an absolute flamethrower, I believe, for St. Louis back in the day. And Bob Gibson was a shutdown, modern-day version of like a Pedro Martinez or someone to that effect. And Bob Gibson was, without a doubt, one of the most dominant pitchers in the history of the game. So he, again, made the honorable mention list. Josh Gibson, I'm not as familiar with him, so I can't really go into too much detail about him. This next one, in the next few, I'm looking at this list, man. Woo, this is a tough list to justify, to not have some of these names on the top 25 list. But Ken Griffey Jr., for those that did not see Ken Griffey Jr. play, now I saw his father, Ken Griffey Sr., play also. He was on the same team with Johnny Bench in the 1970s, the Cincinnati Reds, and Ken Griffey Sr. was a great player. But Ken Griffey Jr. was an iconic player during his era. He had one of the sweetest swings I've ever seen in the game, a beautiful left-handed swing. He was a phenomenal center fielder. The guy hit for average. He hit for power. And I remember seeing him at the 1999 All-Star game at Fenway Park. He participated in the Home Run Derby, which I was at in person, thanks to a good friend of mine who got me tickets. And the display that he put on was just astonishing. However, it failed in comparison when Mark McGwire finally came up to hit in the Home Run Derby. I don't think I'd ever seen anyone hit the ball as far as Mark McGwire did in that Home Run Derby. It was just unbelievable. So according to this list, Ken Griffey Jr. is an honorable mention and not in the top 25. One of the greatest pitchers in the history of the game, Lefty Grove from the early 1900s, dominating pitcher, one of the very best in the old era of baseball. Very, very tough name not to have in that top 25. And again, going into that same era, Nap LaJoy was a guy who I believe his lifetime batting average was somewhere in the 350s, only slightly below, I think it was 358, below Ty Cobb, who had the all-time batting average high number of 367. So Nap LaJoy did not make the top 25. Now, earlier I talked about Bob Gibson. We had Pedro Martinez, who pitched for the Montreal Expos, and then, of course, later on in his career for the Boston Red Sox. I got to see Pedro Martinez pitch in person, and I got to see him pitch for several years. Now, I'm finally looking down at my screen. I see people in here. Sorry I haven't been paying attention. I'm off the screen on another screen going on about some of these baseball players. So hopefully you guys are baseball fans. Please share my live if you could. Please follow me if you're new. We're going down right now the honorable mention list from Bleacher Report of players that did not make the top 25 of all time in Major League Baseball. And I did sneak ahead, Michael. I see your comment. Ted's on the list, but Ted is not number one. So I'm not going to give away too many. So I'm going to go through this honorable mention list, give a little bit of talk about them, and then get into the top 25 list. As you all know, I'm a huge baseball guy. So hopefully you enjoy this show. I'm just taking a break from politics today. I wanted to do something a little bit different. So anyway, Pedro Martinez, one of the most dominant pitchers I've ever seen. I saw him pitch live in the 1999 All-Star Game at Fenway Park, and he struck out the best hitters the National League had to offer. He was unbelievable. For a period of time, Pedro Martinez was the most dominant pitcher I ever saw pitch, but then he had arm trouble later in his career, and that probably is what partially kept him off this list of being in the top 25. So continuing on the honorable mention list, some of you probably don't know this name, but you might know him from being a commentator. But back on that 1975 Cincinnati Reds team, you had Johnny Bench, you had Pete Rose, you had Ken Griffey Jr.'s father, Ken Griffey Sr. The second baseman on that team was a guy by the name of Joe Morgan. Joe Morgan was a very good baseball player. And I remember he used to get up at this plate. He was a left-handed hitter, and he used to do this funky thing with his back elbow where he would like kind of move it up and down while he was preparing to hit. I don't know why he did that, but he was a good player. But I do agree that he probably does not belong in that top 25 list. The next one on the list, one of the most dominant left-handed pitchers in the history of the game. He was a left-handed pitcher. I think he won 167 games in his career, played for the Dodgers. Sandy Koufax, dominating. I think he was very similar to like a Pedro Martinez. He was in the major leagues before I was alive, so I didn't get to watch him pitch live. But from the stories I've heard, Sandy Koufax was just dominating. He only won 167 games, but that's because he ended up with arm trouble later in his career. He was a smaller guy that threw gas and just burnt his arm out. Now, this name here, this one's a tough one because I don't know what decision they went by in leaving this one off the top 25. Now, Satchel Paige, this could be because he didn't play in the major leagues for a very long amount of time. Satchel Paige was most likely the best African-American pitcher in the Negro Leagues back in the early to mid-1900s. Back before Jackie Robinson came into the major leagues, there was a separate league called the Negro Leagues in which all of the African-American or Black American players played in. And Satchel Paige was one of the dominant pitchers, if not the dominant pitcher, in the Negro Leagues back in the early to mid-1900s. Now, Satchel Paige, at the very, very, very end of his career, when he was a very old man, I think he was in his mid to late 40s, he finally did get the call up to the major leagues after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, but he was way past his prime at that point. Now, the next one on this list, the next few, I don't know how these names don't make it. I mean, the next name on this list, Albert Pujols. A lot of you probably know him. I've got some younger people in the show right now in the live. Albert Pujols, over 600 home runs, approaching 700, powerful hitter, great player. I mean, honestly, if I'm making the top 25 list, I'd find it very hard to leave Pujols off the list. Now, the next name on the list is very similar in the way he produced. Some of you probably don't know this name, but if you're a real baseball fan and you know baseball history, the name Frank Robinson. Now, no relation to Jackie Robinson, who's next on the list, but Frank Robinson, I believe, hit 570 or so home runs in his career, dominant power hitter of the mid-1900s, and was really just a phenomenal baseball player. So it's hard to imagine a guy with 570 career home runs not as one of the top 25 baseball players of all time, but Bleacher Report does not have him in that top 25. So the next one on the list is Jackie Robinson. Again, Jackie Robinson, I can kind of understand this. Now, if you're going to go on the merit of his career alone, if you look at his numbers, he wasn't a big home run hitter, didn't hit for a great average. He was an amazing base stealer, ended up playing a good first base for the Dodgers. And of course, he's iconic for being the first black man to play in the major leagues. Now, does he belong in the top 25? Probably not. But for what he did for baseball and what he did for the black population, Jackie Robinson, obviously one of the most iconic baseball players in the history of the game. And if you go to any major league park, you'll see that Jackie Robinson's number has been retired in every ballpark in the major leagues. And that is something I think that was well deserved. I'll tell you another one that's tough, Cal Ripken Jr. And the next one, oh my God. All right, there are a few coming up I don't agree with. Cal Ripken Jr., he broke Lou Gehrig's record for the most consecutive games played at shortstop. He was a very good baseball player. His father was also a professional baseball player, Cal Ripken Sr. Cal Ripken Jr. was a guy that symbolized, grit, being a hard-nosed ball player. It was amazing that he didn't miss a game for something like, 15 seasons, whatever it was. Does he belong in the top 25 based on talent? Probably not, but you could certainly make an argument for him. The next one, I don't understand this name at all. I don't know how you can't have Nolan Ryan as one of the top 25 baseball players of all time. Woody Bush, good to see you in the show. Michael Key, I see your comments. Satchel Paige's stats weren't good in the majors. You're right. He played. That's the thing with Satchel Paige. He played, late into his 40s, into his early 50s in the major leagues because he had spent most of his career in the Negro leagues where he had a very good record. But if you're judging this on the major leagues, you really can't put him in the top 25. Nolan Ryan, one of the best pitchers in the history of the game. What did he have, 7 no-hitters? If they have Roger Clemens on the top 25 list, I don't know how you can have Roger Clemens on that list and not have Nolan Ryan on that list. Nolan Ryan was the iconic power pitcher of the 1970s, 1980s, led the majors in strikeouts, was just dominant. One of the issues he had is he didn't play for great teams. So his record, he could have had a lot more wins than he had in his career, but there was no one better than Nolan Ryan. And I would say probably a close second to Nolan Ryan in that era was Tom Seaver, another power pitcher, pitched for the Mets, pitched for the Reds, was also a power pitcher of that same 1960s, 1970s, 1980s era, and was, I wouldn't say he was as good as Nolan Ryan, but he was a pretty solid second to Nolan Ryan in that era, but he didn't crack the top 25 either. All right, the last two on the honorable mention list, you have Mike Schmidt, who was a third baseman for the Philadelphia Phillies. I watched him when I was a kid. He was a third baseman that was solid defensively and hit over 500 home runs. I think somewhere in the ballpark of 540 home runs in his career. So Mike Schmidt, another tough one to leave off that top 25 list. The last one on the list, some of you may not know who this is unless you're a real big baseball historian, but Warren Spahn was a pitcher in the 1950s, and he was a lefty, and he had 363 career wins. So Warren Spahn was definitely one of the best pitchers of his era and did not crack the list. All right, so hopefully I'm not boring the hell out of all of you with my baseball talk today. I know you come in and you're expecting politics with the John DeVito show, but not today. I need a break. I need a mental health break. I think we all do. Marco, I see you're here as well. Michael Key made a comment. Right now, your comment about Nolan Ryan, I don't know how he didn't make the top 25, and I'm sure I'm going to have some problems with this top 25 list as I go on. Hasselhoff, me too. Baseball is by far my favorite sport. I love everything about it. You're right, Michael Key. I think maybe until recently, but Ryan was a player that pitched over 100 miles an hour. He was the first guy to top 100 miles an hour back in the day, and I can't even imagine getting into the box facing some guy that throws over 100 miles an hour. It's just insanity. Of course, though, he's probably not on the list, but I think probably the scariest pitcher I ever saw throw, and I saw him pitch live in person, was Randy Johnson for the Seattle Mariners. I mean, this guy was as ugly as sin, 6'10", a big lefty. He was mean as hell, and he'd get up on that mound at 6'10". He must have looked 8 feet tall, throwing that ball up around 100 miles an hour. And I'll never forget the time he hit Red Sox left fielder Mike Greenwell in the head with a fastball. Mike Greenwell was a tough guy. He grew up in Florida. His nickname was Gator because he grew up literally wrestling alligators. Once Randy Johnson hit him, because Randy Johnson was a lefty, Greenwell batted lefty. He hit him in the head, and Greenwell at that point said he would never get in the batter's box again against Randy Johnson. And I don't believe he did for the rest of his career. And quite frankly, I don't blame him. So let me get into this list. We're going to talk about this top 25 list. I'm going to try not to spend too much time on all the players. I do know a lot about quite a few of these players, and I'm not going to get into too much of a historical thing. But number 25 on the list, I already have a problem with this one. Now, a lot of you probably won't know who this is, and I might read about him so you understand why he's on this list. I'm not sure how Nolan Ryan cannot be on the list, but at number 25 from the early 1900s, you have Grover Cleveland Alexander. Now, some of you probably don't know him, so let me read this paragraph about him so you know why he's on this list. So Grover Cleveland Alexander, of the 7 pitchers that were highlighted, 4 hail from a bygone era where managers would laugh at the phrase pitch count. Now, that is true. In today's baseball, they're so concerned about pitch count. I think back on the 1975 World Series, Game 6, I think it was, or maybe it was Game 7, Louis Tiant pitched for the Boston Red Sox against the Cincinnati Reds in that 1975 World Series. And if you look back on the stats, I think they pulled him in like the 7th or 8th inning, but he threw 166 pitches. I mean, back in these days, they did not worry about pitch counts. You know, they didn't have middle relief guys. If you were a starting pitcher, they were looking to get 9 innings out of you. And if you threw 200 pitches, you threw 200 pitches. So anyway, they laughed at pitch count back in the day. And I guess Grover Cleveland Alexander was considered to be the preeminent workhorse ace of that time. So he threw apparently in his career over 5,000 innings. He completed. Now think about this. I mean, how many complete games do the best pitchers in the major leagues have now? But he completed 436 of his 600 starts. That is insanity. That's unheard of. I mean, I don't think probably in the last 10 years we've had a combined 436 complete games by a starter. But this guy completed 436 of 600 starts, posted a lifetime ERA of 2.56, and that adjusted to, I guess, a 135 ERA, whatever that means. But from 1915 to 1920, he missed nearly the entire 1918 campaign serving in the military, and he notched an ERA under 2.00 each of those seasons. So I guess they're saying there are plenty of pitchers that one might prefer in a must-win game, but if you're looking for a guy with grit and who just completed games and was a gamer, I guess that's why he's on this list. But again, I'm not sure that justifies having him on this list over Nolan Ryan. To me, that doesn't make sense. So keep in mind, everybody, I'm on my screen. I'll pop back to the chat in a little bit. I'm going to run down some of these lists. Now, this one I do agree with. I'm not sure if you all know who this is, but I have his baseball autographed in my office. Jimmy Fox, he played for the Red Sox for a while. He hit 534 home runs in his career. But when you think of that honorable mention list, you had Frank Robinson with 570 home runs. You had Mike Schmidt, 536 home runs. So there were players on that top 25, on the honorable mention list that did not make this list that had more home runs than someone like a Jimmy Fox. But Jimmy Fox did have a lifetime batting average of 328. I mean, he hit 548 home runs. I mean, he was, a very, very good player. And I guess he played his last full season in 1941, and that amounted to a 14-year window. So if you think about it, he only played for 14 years in the major leagues and still hit 548 home runs during the course of his career. So that's pretty amazing. They actually have 2 different numbers here. I actually go back in my knowledge. I think the number 534 is the correct number of home runs he actually hit. So Jimmy Fox, number 4, I do really agree with that. Now, here's another old-timer, a lefty, and they have a picture of his swing. Some of you may not know who this is, but this is number 23 on their list is Mel Ott. Again, Frank Robinson, pretty good hitter. Mike Schmidt. Mel Ott was definitely a great player. He never batted over 400, and he never swatted 50 home runs in a season, but he did register an OPS above 1,000 in 7 of his 22 seasons with the New York Giants. So the guy had a great career. If you think about it, he batted 304. He hit 511 home runs. So the guy was obviously a great, great hitter, and he was a lefty that played in the Polo Grounds. Now, for those of you that don't know about the Polo Grounds, that was an old stadium that doesn't exist anymore. And I guess 323 of his home runs were hit in the Polo Grounds, but they had an extremely short right field porch. I think it was somewhere in the ballpark of like 280 feet. So it was a very short right field. So you have to wonder, does that maybe throw things off a little bit in scale? I mean, if you would put someone like a Ted Williams in the Polo Grounds. Now, if you've ever been to Fenway Park, if you hit a home run into the bullpen at Fenway Park, it's 380 feet. I mean, if you hook one around Pesky's pole in right field, it's 302, but that very rarely, if ever, happens. So generally, when Williams was hitting his home runs, he had to hit the ball in general like 380 feet to clear that right field fence when you have this guy, Mel Ott, who was maybe hitting the ball 300 feet. So that's kind of a questionable, I think, call in my opinion on Bleacher Report. All right, number 22, I do agree with this. I'm not sure if all of you are base stealing fans, but Ricky Henderson, all-time base stealer, he was actually kind of a jerk as a person. I didn't really like Ricky Henderson, but you could not deny how good he was. I mean, one season, he stole 130 bases in one season, and I mean, he blew away Lou Brock's record of stolen bases in his career. I mean, he was unbelievable. He was a guy that you could it was almost impossible to throw him out in a certain circumstance. But I mean, on top of his base stealing, he walked a lot. He had a great eye. He was a leadoff hitter that had power. He could lead off the game and hit a home run. And also with his speed defensively, he was also very good. I mean, he certainly had an ego that matched his talent, but I don't know how you could leave the number one all-time base stealer, a guy that had 130 steals in one season, over 1,000 steals in his career, off the list. So I do agree with Ricky Henderson being on this list. All right, number 21 on the list, Eddie Collins, another old-timer. For those of you that don't know who Eddie Collins was, he was an amazing ball player. He also stole 744 bases in his career. His lifetime batting average was .333 with a .424 on-base percentage. He was a manager's dream leadoff hitter. He drew 1,500 walks during the course of his career. I mean, Eddie Collins was a great hitter. He didn't have power, though. That was one thing. If you look at him, he had a career 47 home runs in his career, and he was a second baseman. So despite his power, he still had a 409 OBA, and it ties him with Willie Mays and Mike Trout on the list. So, he was obviously a great player, but is he in the top 25? There were a lot of good players that were left off that list that were in that honorable mention list. I mean, you look at someone like Pete Rose, and again, I know Pete Rose gambled on baseball, and they have him in the honorable mention list. I may have skipped over him, but he was a guy that had almost 4,300 hits in his career. He beat Ty Cobb's record. And Pete Rose, I'll tell you, if you guys didn't get to see him play, he played in the 70s again, part of that big red machine team. Johnny Bench, Joe Morgan, Ken Griffey Sr. I mean, they were an amazing team. And Pete Rose, I've never in my career seen a guy play as hard as he did. I mean, he was hard-nosed, head-first diving. I think of the All-Star game back in the mid to late 70s, I think it was, when he actually ended the career of catcher Ray Fosse. I mean, back in the day, you think about the All-Star games, they really don't mean a lot. Pete Rose came barreling around third base and completely took out the catcher Ray Fosse at that time and broke his leg, in essence, ending the guy's career in an All-Star game. So, you get a guy like Eddie Collins on this list. You don't have a Mike Schmidt. You don't have a Frank Robinson. You don't have a Nolan Ryan. You don't have a Pete Rose. I think it's kind of hard not to have him on this list. Oh, this next person. All right, guys, number 20. I hate the Yankees. I'm a Red Sox fan. And this guy here certainly is a Yankee that I can't stand. Steve, welcome to the show. I see Michael Key's comment. The recent pitches are measured at the mound and not at the plate. They measured Ryan's pitches at the plate. Good point. No one has beaten his speed if they measure at the plate. That's a very good point, Michael. You're absolutely right with that. So number 20 on the list, I'm not even going to talk about this guy. I don't like him. Alex Rodriguez, A-Rod, obviously a great talent. But I got to tell you, this is a funny story about A-Rod. You guys are going to appreciate this. This year, the Red Sox made the playoffs. So I went to one of the games with my kids, and we got there, and ESPN was set up right outside of Fenway Park. They had their outdoor stage. Big Papi was there. There must have been 10,000 people standing outside of Fenway Park watching them record for ESPN. So you had David Ortiz up there, you had Frank Thomas, and then you had Alex Rodriguez. Big Papi, obviously a huge Red Sox favorite, would stand up, and you get a standing ovation for everybody in the crowd. People were going nuts. And then he would point at Alex Rodriguez, and the entire crowd would start booing Rodriguez. And then there was one Red Sox fan that came out, and you know that, obviously Alex Rodriguez dated Jennifer Lopez, was with her for many years. She also dated Ben Affleck, and I think that she's back with him now. It got to be very silent after people were booing Rodriguez. All of a sudden, this loudmouth Red Sox fan yelled out, "Hey, A-Rod, how does Ben Affleck's dick taste?" Then you heard like 10,000 Red Sox fans burst into laughter. A-Rod had to have heard this comment. And I'll never forget back in 2004 when the Red Sox beat the Yankees and he's running down the first base line and he slapped the ball out of the pitcher's hand. I've never liked A-Rod. He never was accepted in New York as far as a Yankee, especially when you had Jeter there. So I guess you're going to have A-Rod on the list. I just don't like him. So I think I would put anybody in his place just because I don't like A-Rod as a person. Was he a great ball player? Yes. Did he hit a lot of home runs? Yes. I mean, he made a ton of money. I just think he's a jerk. And he was also a Gold Glove award-winning shortstop before the Yankees moved him over. Oh, he made the list. Now, see, I have a problem with this. Now, number 19, we're talking about pitchers, and I was talking about Randy Johnson. They have Randy Johnson at number 19 on this list. How do you put him ahead of Nolan Ryan? I don't think you can do it. I think that this is, while I loved Randy Johnson, he is definitely one of the ugliest pitchers in the history of the game, but also one of the most intimidating pitchers ever. And for those of you that never saw it, go onto YouTube and Google the time that Randy Johnson threw a pitch and it hit a bird, and the bird literally exploded at the game. It happened during a game. Just randomly, he was pitching. He threw his pitch, and a bird flew right into his pitch, and it exploded. But let's see. Let me read a little bit about Randy Johnson here and see how they justified this over Nolan Ryan. So Randy Johnson didn't get started until his late 20s, so I guess that's something. A solid yet wildly erratic starter early in his career. His name was the Big Unit. I don't know why he had that nickname, and I don't want to know. But he finally lowered his walk ratio to a passable 3.49 per 9 innings in 1999. But that's what made him scary also. He was 6'10 and threw like 98 miles an hour and was wild, so he scared the shit out of people. So at the age of 29, and that was during the age of his 29 season, when he was 29 years old. So he also produced a 3.24 ERA and 308 strikeouts in that career-defining season. So, I mean, he was dominating. There's no doubt about it. From 1993 to 2008, his last hurrah, Johnson spun a 3.15 ERA and a much-improved 2.65 base on balls per 9 innings. He won 4 ERA titles, 5 Cy Young Awards, including 4 in a row from 1999 to 2002, and shared the 2001 World Series MVP honors with Curt Schilling, who eventually ended up playing for the Red Sox and helped erase the curse of the Bambino in Boston. So those Cy Young Awards were arguably in the most dominant 4-year stretch ever. During those 4 years, he averaged a mind-boggling 354 strikeouts per season, while also yielding a 2.49 ERA. He did this all during the steroid era, which is a very good point, and he did it after turning the age of 35. So those are all good points. It does say no starting pitcher with at least 1,000-plus innings amassed, racked up more strikeouts per 9 innings than Randy Johnson, who trails Nolan Ryan for the all-time mark. Okay, so there you go. If not such a late bloomer, he would belong in the top 10. But, again, we're arguing that, Randy Johnson belongs in this list. He still came in second place to Nolan Ryan. How can Nolan Ryan not be in this list? I think that is definitely one of the biggest gaffes in this list, not to have Nolan Ryan in this top 25. He deserved it. Now, moving ahead from Randy Johnson, a very good pitcher from back in the early 1900s, dominant. And if you don't know a lot about baseball history, think about Roger Clemens, think about Nolan Ryan, think about Tom Seaver, think about those type of pitchers. You had Christy Mathewson, who was a very, very good pitcher in the early 1900s. I'm going to read a little bit about him so you know why he's on this list, because he was very dominant. So he was pitching, though, during a powerless era. Now, if you remember, going back to this era in the early 1900s, Babe Ruth, when he hit 60 home runs, that was the absolute unthinkable. When he hit 60 home runs that season, most of the major league teams combined didn't hit 60 home runs. So Babe Ruth hitting 60 home runs was almost like the equivalent of someone coming up and hitting 200 home runs today. It was just unheard of. But Christy Mathewson did pitch during that era where there was not a lot of long ball. So you got to kind of take that into account. So Christy Mathewson's ERA was 2.13, which is pretty amazing. And that just showed how dominant he was. His longevity, however, still deserves recognition. The Giants ace worked at least 266 innings in 14 consecutive seasons, 6 of which he earned an ERA of 2.0 or lower. So this guy had an ERA under 2 in 6 seasons. I mean, that's pretty amazing. Having tossed 435 complete games, which is astonishing, he can also claim 373 career victories. So those are, even if it was in a powerless era, those are very impressive numbers. I mean, 435 complete games, 373 victories, 6 seasons with an ERA under 2. I don't know how you can probably argue him not being on this list, unless I guess the only argument you could put forward is there weren't that many great hitters during this list. So Matheson also personified the workhorse role by tossing complete game shutouts in games 1, 3, and 5 of the Giants' World Series triumph over the Philadelphia Athletics back in 1905. Despite authoring a career 0.97 postseason ERA, the Giants fell short in 3 straight championships from 1911 to 1913. So Pedro Martinez and Sandy Koufax were both aces whose surreal primes beckoned for inclusion, but they combined to only pitch 363 more frames than Matheson. So I think you got to say that Christy Matheson deserves to be on this list. All right, number 17. This is obviously a no-brainer. I don't need to talk too much about this guy. Joe Dimaggio. We all know who he is. I would have guessed, quite frankly, he would have been a little bit higher on this list. Obviously, an iconic New York Yankee. And even though I hate the Yankees, I can't hate Joe Dimaggio. I mean, he ended up the year Ted Williams hit 406. Ted Williams did not get the MVP that year. Joe Dimaggio, I think it was 1941, got the MVP that year because that's when he hit in 56 straight games without making an out. And no one's been able to eclipse that since. So Joe Dimaggio started the season and hit 56 consecutive games with a hit. And that is such an impossible thing to do. I remember Pete Rose, I think it was in the late 70s, early 80s, had a nice stretch of like 44 straight games without going hitless in a game. But Joe Dimaggio, the 56 straight games, that's one of those records that may never be beat. Because, I mean, all you need is one bad game. It doesn't matter how good of a hit you are. So I'd say that Joe Dimaggio definitely deserves to be on this list. But, I mean, he had an overall great career also. I mean, he had 2,700 hits in his career, lifetime batting average of .325. He had 454 home runs and was also a part of those phenomenal Yankees teams that won so many championships. Now, this one kind of surprises me. Number 16, he doesn't surprise me because he's on the list. And good to see everybody in here. I see Michael Key comment, Crazy Train, welcome to the show. Marco, welcome back. This is all baseball today, so if you're not a baseball fan, I apologize. I need a break from all the war stuff and all the news stuff. Fields were a lot bigger back then. You're right, Michael Key. Number 16 on the list, this guy, in my opinion, is the best modern-day pitcher in baseball. If you didn't see this guy pitch, he was just astonishing. And I'm a little surprised he's not higher on the list than number 16, Greg Maddox. And also this team, they had Tom Glavine, they had John Smoltz. Those Braves teams of the 90s should have won more championships with the pitching they did. But Greg Maddox was a guy, pinpoint control. I'm going to read a little bit about him so you understand, if you didn't see him pitch, how dominating he was. Now, he wasn't a guy, though, like a Roger Clemens. He wasn't a guy like a Nolan Ryan or a Randy Johnson that threw gas. I mean, he came in and threw the ball, 88 miles an hour, but his command was amazing. He had numerous pitches, and he was unhittable. So here it is. The command king of Major League Baseball issued a stellar 1.80 base on balls over 9 innings on an average during his brilliant career, in which he worked over 5,000 innings. He had pinpoint control that usually got hit hard in a reality he was met with during the later years in his solid innings of performances. Despite his ERA being north of 4 in all but 5 of his seasons, Maddox did retire with a 3.16 ERA, and the Atlanta Braves ace snatched 4 National League Cy Young Awards and 4 ERA titles. And that was he had 4 seasons where he was under 2. His lowest ERA was 1994, where his ERA for the season was 1.56. In 1994, it was 1.63. So, I mean, just absolutely astonishing. And you have to remember, too, when Maddox pitched, he was pitching in the era of the steroid era, where he was facing guys like McGuire and, Sammy Sosa, Barry Bonds, guys that were juicing. So he wasn't pitching in a dead ball era. So I guess when you look at his overall performance, he did have some years where he did get hit. I think part of the reason was, he did not throw the gas. He didn't have that overwhelming velocity, but he was just an amazing pitcher that had a multitude of pitchers. Number 15 on the list, I don't know how you have Roger Clemens on the list without having Nolan Ryan on the list. Number 15, Roger Clemens, obviously a long-time Red Sox pitcher. In my mind, he was a trader. He left the Red Sox, went to Toronto, then on to the Yankees. He also pitched for Houston. Roger Clemens was a great pitcher. He was a pleasure to watch in Boston, and he was the modern-day Nolan Ryan. He was the modern-day Tom Seaver. He was the modern-day power pitcher. He posted ERAs below 2 in 2 seasons. He was dominant. He was right up there with Ryan and Jackson. He's third in all-time strikeouts behind Nolan Ryan and Randy Johnson. The Rocket was his nickname. He won the highest pitching honor at least once in all 4 steps. So for the old school readers, though, he garnered 6 20-win seasons, and he had over 354 wins during his dominant career. And again, you have to think that when Roger Clemens pitched too, you didn't have guys throwing complete games anymore like you did in the early eras. So Roger Clemens was a guy that wanted to strike you out. He was a dominant pitcher. He was a competitor. He'd throw at you. He did have 6 20-win seasons, 354 career victories. He was third all-time on the strikeout list. So he was a dominant pitcher. Does he deserve to be on the list over Nolan Ryan? I mean, Nolan Ryan had multiple no-hitters. Roger Clemens never threw one. I guess you could make the argument, but if I had to choose my list, I would probably have Nolan Ryan on this list over Roger Clemens. And Roger Clemens also was accused of taking steroids. I mean, there were no accusations of Nolan Ryan doing anything like that. So number 14 on the list, Tris Speaker. Tris Speaker, another player from the early 1900s, played for the Red Sox for a while. He clocked 117 home runs, but keep in mind, this was an era where there were not a lot of home runs. So back in those days, that was not a terrible number. But he had a 500 slugging percentage, major league record of 792 doubles. He was a lifetime 345 hitter and was just one of the best hitters of all time. So Tris Speaker, he accumulated, if you think of this number, maybe he didn't have a lot of home runs, but he accumulated 222 triples during his career, also stole 436 bases, and only struck out 394 times during his 22-year career. So if you think of that number, 394 strikeouts during a 22-year career. The guy obviously was a master of making contact, and for a guy that batted 345 in his career, I definitely think he deserves to be on the top 25 list. But there are some other plays that maybe deserve to be there as well. But you can't argue with Tris Speaker, in my opinion. Number 13, no-brainer, Mickey Mantle. Obviously one of the most iconic baseball legends of all time. 536 career home runs. Switch hitter. Had the amazing season in 1961 where he finished his career just short of Roger Maris that season. Roger Maris broke Babe Ruth's record of 60 home runs by hitting 61. And that season, the whole season, you had Mantle and Maris, battling out. And no one really wanted Roger Maris to win that record or beat that record of 60 home runs. And he ended up doing it. It really went through a lot. If you haven't seen the HBO miniseries that was filmed about that season, I think it was actually called 61. It showed all the trials and tribulations that Roger Maris went through. The media hated him. The fans didn't want him to beat Babe Ruth's record. They all wanted Mantle to break the record. But late in the season, Mantle kind of broke down with injuries and ended up missing some time at the end of the season. And Roger Maris ended up finally beating that record of Babe Ruth that he held for so long. But, Mantle was just iconic. I'm even a little bit surprised he's maybe not in the top 10, but certainly he's a guy that deserves to be in the top 25. Now, here's a guy, number 12, I think the number was. Let me scroll back up. Yeah, number 12 on the list, Honus Wagner. Now, some of you may know his name because his baseball card is worth more than any baseball card out there. If you happen to come across his old tobacco card from the early 1900s at the yard sale, grab it in a hurry because you're going to get 7 figures from that card. So Honus Wagner's on the list, one of the greatest baseball players in the history of the game. His T 206 tobacco card, recently sold for over $3 million. And he was known as most likely maybe the greatest shortstop to ever play the game. He ended up, I think he ended his career with 3,420 hits. He had over 700 stolen bases, and he never hit more than 10 home runs in a season. But again, this was part of that dead ball era, or the non-power era, where not really many players were hitting home runs. So, but he was just amazing. He had 643 doubles in his career, on top of the 700 stolen bases, 252 triples. So the guy had great speed. He was a great shortstop, stole a lot of bases, and was just one of the iconic players in Major League Baseball. So I have no problem with him being on that list. Now, how about number 11, Stan the Man Musial? Does he deserve to be above Mickey Mantle on this list? I'm not sure. But Stan the Man Musial played for the Cardinals. Again, another player that played, I think, 1950s, 1940s, somewhere in that area. He was a left-handed hitter, hit 475 home runs in his career. He retired with a .331 lifetime batting average. So, I mean, the guy had batted .331, 475 home runs. He was a great ball player. And in 1948, actually batted .376 and took a run at 400. And that year, he also hit a career high of 39 home runs. So he almost reminds me. It seems like he was kind of more of almost like a Ted Williams type of player. I mean, Ted Williams wasn't just a long ball hitter, even though Ted Williams hit 521 home runs and missed 5 years of his career. But Stan Musial, very good all-around player. And he did miss some time also in the military. I guess he missed the 1945 season. So you may have actually seen him eclipse that 50 home run mark if he had missed that season. But he did have 3,630 hits. So obviously a great player. You got to have him in the top 25. I'm not sure if I'd have him above Mantle, but definitely deserves to be in that top 25. Now we're going back to the early era. This guy had the second highest batting average in the history of baseball. Rogers Hornsby, he batted, if I remember correctly, 359, or was it 358? I have to look. It was 358 during the course of his career. The only guy in the history of baseball that had a higher batting average than him of his career was Cobb, who batted 367. Now, if you think about that, 358, that's amazing. So among all hitters who amassed at least 3,000 plate appearances, only Cobb had a higher batting average than Hornsby. Hornsby surpassed 403 seasons in his career. So, I mean, everyone makes a big deal about Ted Williams hitting 406 back in 1941, I think it was. Hornsby did it 3 times during the course of his career. In 1922, he batted 401 and also hit 42 home runs that season. So that's pretty amazing. I mean, Rogers Hornsby, one of the greatest players to ever play the game, and certainly deserves to be on the list. And, I mean, he's right up there with the greatest of the great. I'm kind of surprised he wasn't maybe even a little bit higher on the list. So let me scroll up a little bit. We've kind of moved up the list a little bit, and I jumped ahead a little bit too quickly. I want to make sure we don't miss anybody. All right, we got Hornsby. So going down into that top 10 now, we get down to number 9 on the list. Number 9, man, Cy Young. Now, Cy Young, obviously, they named the pitching award after him every year. Cy Young was one of those guys. There were no middlemen back when Cy Young played. I don't even believe there were any closers back then. Cy Young won 511 games in his career. Compare that to Roger Clemens, who won how many? I think it was 346. Cy Young, 511 career wins, and he hurled, get ready for this, 7,356 innings in his career. 7,356 innings. That is absolute insanity. That's crazy. So Cy Young was still considered to be an incomparable workhorse in the late 1890s and early 1900s. He tossed over 1,000 frames more than runner-up pitcher. Now get ready for this name, Pud Galvin, P-U-D, Pud. That's a great name, who had 6,000 innings pitched during that period of time. So as a result, the namesake for an award honoring pitching excellence accrued the most wins, but also the most losses in his career. I mean, this is just insanity. He had a lifetime 2.63 ERA, and he just ate up innings. So he pitched 22 seasons, and his ERA never hovered above 4, not even once, even late in his career. Yet it slid below 2 6 times, including twice during his 40s. So for better or worse, it's really impossible to compare him to anybody else, because not only did he win over 500 games, he lost over 300 games. And when you compare that to Clemens, who won over 300 games, this guy lost over 300 games. So, all right, moving ahead, another great pitcher, number 8 on the list, Walter Johnson. Walter Johnson was the consummate power pitcher in the early 1900s. From 1907 to 1919, Walter Johnson posted a composite 1.65 ERA. That's over the course of 12 years. With 8 seasons left in his Hall of Fame career, the Washington Senators ace had already compiled 297 victories. He had the Cy Young Award. It existed at that time. He would have won numerous awards. After all, he accrued at least 320 innings with an ERA of 1.90 or lower in 7 straight seasons. And that streak was ended in 1917, when his ERA bloated, which I think is funny, to 2.21 for that season. So the 2-time MVP was just an unbelievable picture. He was obviously one of the very best in the history of the game, and he had over 400 wins in his career. And also, if you think about this was a guy that threw gas. Nobody hit more batters than he did. He was the only hurler to finish with well over 100 hits batsmen and also over 100 shutouts in the career. So, I mean, again, if you get a guy throwing gas, he's willing to hit you. That makes sense. All right, number 7 on the list, another no-brainer. I mean, one of the greatest players in the history of the game. Obviously iconic for the player that came down with a terrible disease that ended his career prematurely. And I still love the story of Lou Gehrig and Wally Pip. Wally Pip was the first baseman for the New York Yankees, and he felt sick one day, and he took a day off. Didn't feel well, didn't feel like he could play. Lou Gehrig stepped in at first base and then played 2,130 consecutive games until he had to finally retire due to having Lou Gehrig's disease, MLS. So I've heard the story many times. Don't be Wally Pip. Don't be the guy that gives up your position, because you never know when Lou Gehrig is going to step in and steal your position. His stats probably would have been better. He died, unfortunately, at a very young age. He was only 37 years old when he died, but he still amassed a .340 batting average and hit 497 home runs in his career. And if he had been able to play, another few more years, and if he was healthy, because I know at the end of his career he was struggling with health, he certainly would have been, would have even had more impressive numbers than he did. But you can't argue with Lou Gehrig being at the top of this list, in my opinion. Number 6 on the list, probably the most hated baseball player in the history of the game, Ty Cobb, the Georgia Peach, who I think in general, people absolutely despise this guy as a person. If you've ever seen the movie Cobb, Tommy Lee Jones portrayed Ty Cobb in this movie. I mean, the guy was insane. He carried a gun, threatened to kill people. I mean, he would go in, feet up, and look to spike people every base he could. He was literally a despised person in the major leagues. But he was also a guy that batted .367 in his career, which is the highest batting average in the history of the game. It was kind of funny. In his first debut season, he came up in only 41 games as a rookie and only batted .240. And then he never batted again below .316 during the 23 seasons that he played in the major leagues. Along his way, he topped 400 3 times and won a dozen batting titles. So Ty Cobb, I mean, he's legendary. He's infamous. Everybody knows who he is. And he did have that autobiography written about him by the autobiographer Al Stump. He called him Stumpy all throughout that movie. Was it a great movie, the Tommy Lee Jones portrayal? Not really, but it does kind of show what a complete lunatic Ty Cobb was. But he was one of the greatest players to ever put on the uniform. Number 5, you can't argue with this. Hank Aaron, number 5 on the list. And honestly, Hank Aaron, in my opinion, could have been top 3. I mean, home runs were not everything. Of course, he hit 755 career home runs, and he was the all-time home run champ until Barry Bonds and his steroids knocked him off the list. But he was unbelievable. He had a .305 career batting average. He had 3,700 career hits in his career. I mean, he was an amazing baseball player, not just a home run hitter. He was, pretty good in the field as well, and he was just an amazing ball player. So Hank Aaron, if you're going to talk about one of the best baseball players in the history of the game, you have to have Hank Aaron on that list. And his numbers, honestly, are better than number 4. I'm a Red Sox fan, and Ted Williams always wanted to be known as the greatest hitter of all time. Ted Williams came in at number 4 on this list, and I do agree with him being in the top 5 or 10. And one of the reasons being is he was just unbelievable. He was a guy that didn't have 3,000 hits. He had 521 career home runs, batted .344, was the last person to bat over 400 in his career. And the story of that day was pretty amazing. Ted Williams, going into the last game or games of the season, he had a doubleheader on the last day of the season. He had a batting average of .399.6, and Ted Williams had the option of sitting out those 2 games, and they would have rounded up his batting average to 400. So he could have ended the season batting 400, and he would have been the first player to do that in quite some time, even back then. Ted Williams said, hell no, I'm playing. He played in both games of that doubleheader, ended up going a combined 6 for 8 in those 2 games, and it raised his batting average from .399.7 to where it ended that season at .406. What's amazing still, I mentioned this earlier in the podcast, is Ted Williams batted .406 that season. He did not win the MVP. Joe Dimaggio hit in 56 consecutive games that season and ended up getting the MVP that season because that was also an amazing thing that had happened. Now, don't forget, Williams also, when he hit 520 home runs, also missed 3 seasons to fighting in World War II. Not only was Ted Williams one of the greatest hitters, if not the greatest hitter to ever play the game, he was also one of the best fighter pilots and also known as one of the best fly fishermen in the world. So Ted Williams was a fighter pilot. Despite his height of 6'3" or 6'4", I can't imagine how he fit too well in that cockpit. But if he hadn't missed those 3 years in his prime of playing baseball in the major leagues, he would have easily eclipsed 600 home runs and 3,000 hits. So I think that's one of the reasons why you have him so high. But Ted Williams, if you're a Boston fan, he's a legend. I wish I could have seen him play in person. He would have been an amazing player to see. But he was a guy also that was hated by the media. The media in Boston did not like him. He had a kind of a hate-hate relationship with the Boston media, like a lot of players do. So anyway, Ted Williams, in my opinion, my favorite baseball player of all time, and certainly deserves to be high up on that list. Number 3 on the list, Barry Bonds. Barry Bonds, great player, was always a great player. He took steroids. He won the all-time home run title away from Hank Aaron. He did it on steroids. He broke the single-season record by hitting 73 home runs in one season in 2001. And you have to wonder, what would it have been if Barry Bonds hadn't taken steroids? But the thing of it is, everyone dumps on the players that took steroids during that steroid era. But the bottom line is, all of the players were doing it, and they basically had the unofficial blessing from major leagues during that steroid era to take steroids. The major league management all knew that these players were doing what they were doing, but they were coming back after a strike. The ratings in baseball hadn't been good, and when they had guys like McGwire, when they had guys like Sosa, when they had guys like Bonds hitting all these home runs, it brought baseball back. It brought the ratings back, so it's hard to completely penalize these guys for doing what they did because baseball was turning a blind eye to it, and they were all doing it. So fearful pitchers, because he was so dominant, walked him 198 times, 68 times intentionally in one of the seasons of his career where he batted .370. And that year his homer tally dipped down to 46 just because he was being walked so often. But those numbers pale in comparison to the 232 walks, 120 intentional walks that he yielded in 2004. He was unintentionally walked or intentionally walked 120 times in 2004, which is basically unheard of. So you can't hit when you're being walked that many times. I mean, that's amazing to even think about that. So, he was a great player. Number 2 on the list, I believe, was Barry Bonds' uncle. One hell of a baseball family when you look at Barry Bonds Jr., Barry Bonds Sr., who was also in the major leagues. Number 2 on the list, Willie Mays, obviously the say-hey kid, an amazing ball player, great center fielder, hit 660 home runs in his career, had a lifetime batting average of .302, and he was just unbelievable in the field. Made one of the greatest catches in the history of the game in center field over his shoulder, was known as the say-hey kid. I mean, just there's nothing you could say about Willie Mays. Willie Mays deserves to be in the top 5. You can argue whether or not he deserves to be number 2, but he certainly deserves to be in that top 5, in my opinion. Number 1 on the list, the Great Bambino. Now, you have to wonder, does the Babe belong on this list? Does he belong as number 1 on this list? So, not expecting anyone else to occupy the list. I think you can make arguments for other players. But, Babe Ruth, if you think about one of the things that was most amazing about him, he batted .714. He hit 714 home runs, and most of those home runs were hit in his time with the New York Yankees. Before he went to the Yankees, Babe Ruth was an excellent pitcher. He wasn't just a pitcher for the Boston Red Sox. He was an excellent pitcher. His ERA was 2.28, and that was in well over, I think, 1,200 innings on the mound. So he was a very, very good pitcher. And he had 47, between 1916 and 1917, he threw 650 innings, earning 47 wins in those 2 seasons with a 1.88 ERA. So Babe Ruth was just as good a pitcher as he was a hitter. So if you look at a guy that during that short pitching career, he had, an ERA that was 2.28. He won 47 games in 2 seasons, 1.88 ERA, and then he went on to hit 714 home runs in a period of time where nobody was hitting home runs. So what he was doing at that time was unheard of. So Babe Ruth, you can certainly make an argument for him that maybe he didn't deserve to be number 1. But all in all, I do agree with a lot of the choices. Now I'm getting back to my my phone here. And I see that I've got some people in. Rounding third, welcome to the show. Michael, thank you for hanging on so much to this show. I know this is a little bit different than what I've normally done. I see Eric Kirk is here. Welcome, Eric. Good to see you. Bud Selig was, Eric. I see your comment. He definitely enabled Major League Baseball and that whole steroid era. And it was funny. Back in the day, if you think about Jose Canseco, Jose Canseco, Mark McGwire were amazing to watch. And I was able to watch back in 1997 and in 1999, the All-Star game at Fenway Park, where Mark McGwire was hitting moonshots. Not only were they going over the green monster, not only at the time they had a net, not only was it going over the net above the green monster, they were his home runs were going over the light towers. They were on top of the 37-foot tall green monster, over the parking garage behind the street, behind Fenway Park. So if you can think about it, you've got the Green Monster. If you haven't been to Fenway Park, behind the Green Monster, there's a street where they have street vendors. There are a couple of bars across the street. There's a parking garage where I don't know why people park there. There's a top-level parking garage where home runs go into the top level of that parking garage all the time, and you have a good chance of getting a broken window if you park in that parking lot. Now, if you're able to hit a ball over that parking lot and it clears the parking lot and the train tracks, you can literally hit a baseball onto the Mass Pike, which is the highway that brings people from the western part of the state into Boston. So they were talking that day that Mark McGwire was hitting balls onto the Mass Pike, which is just insane to think about him hitting that ball that far. But the bottom line is Bud Selig did enable that steroid era. He did enable these players to take steroids. And Jose Canseco came out and said that everybody in the major leagues was taking steroids and no one believed him. Now, I think back when I played college football, I played back in the late 80s, early 90s, and I played for a 1AA college, University of Rhode Island, and I would say that a good majority of the kids on my team were taking steroids. I took steroids for a period of time, and it was something that a lot of players did. And if you don't think that even today some of these players are using performance-enhancing drugs, they've got to be. You look at someone like a Tom Brady. How is Tom Brady in football 45, 46 years old, still playing like he's 25 years old? And I think that there certainly are performance-enhancing drugs that are part of the game, but it's kind of hard to hold these players accountable. The Roger Clemens, the Mark McGwires, the Barry Bonds, the Sammy Sosas, all these players that played during that era, Alex Rodriguez, they were all reported to take steroids, but they were all doing it. The pitchers were doing it. The hitters were doing it, and that will just go down as the steroid era. So let's see. I see Michael Keys saying, you played football in Middle Tennessee, and it wasn't as advertised, but it went on. But my dad played at UCF, and he said, oh, dude, same thing. Michael, I played at Rhode Island as a defensive tackle, and even one of our kickers was on steroids, our quarterbacks, the whole team. And if you don't think the coaches knew, they all knew. They all knew. They told you. I remember getting called in, and this will be my last story before I wrap this one up. But at the end of my freshman year, I was taken off red shirt, and I ended up playing in the last couple games of the season because we had a lot of injuries and they needed some defensive tackles. So I came off and got a chance to play a little bit at the end of the season. So I got called in to the coach's office. I won't mention any names, but I was called in, and you had a postseason meeting where you sat down and they would go down a list of things with you saying, okay, we need your weight to be here. We need your bench press to be here, your squat to be here. We want your speed to be at this level in the 40-yard dash. And I'll never forget the line. Do any way that you have to, son. Remember, you're on full scholarship here. I mean, you're 18, 19 years old. I'm not the same person as I am now. I wouldn't do it now. But when you're 18 and 19, you're playing college football, and you still have dreams of maybe playing professional football. You want to do what you want to do. And if all the kids on the team are taking steroids and you want to play, you either need to take the steroids or you're not going to be good enough. You're not going to have the strength, and you're not going to have the ability. So that was one thing I was faced at. And in the major leagues, I mean, if I was willing to do it for a full 4-year scholarship, I mean, what are people willing to do if you're going to pay them $20 million a year, right? So there it is. We went down the top 25 list. We listed off the honorable mention names on that list. I think that we could have probably had some of those honorable mention name lists, especially guys like Nolan Ryan, maybe Mike Schmidt, maybe Frank Robinson in that top 25 list. But this was a report or a list created by Bleacher Report. I wanted to get on, break it down, talk about some of the players, basically because I love baseball. So I hope I didn't bore the crap out of all you guys. It looks like I've got some baseball fans in here, and I do appreciate all of you guys that stayed in and listened to the live. This show will be published out to anybody that may want to listen on all the different platforms, and it will be broadcast on WESN if you want to hear it again this weekend on the Epic Strategy Network. So for all of you guys that are here, it's time for baseball season. Let's sit back and enjoy it. Let's see. Oh, I know, rounding third. I've seen your baseball picture, man. I love it. We went down a great list of old-time ball players. I don't know how much of the show you heard, but it will be published. You can listen to the whole thing. Ty Cobb, dude. Ty Cobb, miserable human being, 367 lifetime batting average, batted over 300 in his career, or batted over 400 in his career 3 different times. I mean, just an amazing ball player. Miserable person, but an amazing ball player. He was in the top 5 on the list, which he should have been. Okay, everybody. Hey, listen, thank you for joining in this special edition of the top 25 baseball players of all time. I went down the Bleacher Report list of players, and I hope you enjoyed it. So I might do a few more of these shows just because I'm tired of doing politics. All right, I love you all. Eric, thanks for the thumbs up, everybody. We'll be back soon. And you guys all take care and have a great day. Thanks for joining me. And I see Eric mentioned John Gale. I might try to get into that show at 5 o'clock. Now, Eric, I got to ask you, down in the chat, I tried to get on his show last night, and I noticed he wasn't on at 5 o'clock. So I may try to get onto his show this afternoon. I miss it quite a bit, but I may try to get in today. So everyone, take care, have a great day, and I will be back sometime soon. Love you all now.